Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining our Taking Action Together series. We're going to wait just a few moments to see if more participants join. But as you come in, we just like to say hello. We'll get started in just a few moments. All right, we are now at 1 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself and this program. Once again, hello everyone, and thank you for joining today. My name is Hannah Siegel, and I am the social media and marketing coordinator here at the AHEC, the Alabama Holocaust Education Center. I must first begin by giving an enormous thank you to Larry and Cinda Goldberg, Jeffrey and Gail Bayer, Ron and Donald Hess for their incredible sponsorship of this program. We have many partners who have helped us spread the word that are listed on our website if you'd like to take a peek. And I'm very thankful for our team today, including our wonderful executive director, Lisa, our director of education, Amy, and our new hire, Caleb, for their support, both big and small. This is truly a team effort, and we could not achieve this series without everyone. So big shout out to our team. So a few housekeeping items just to get started. We will be saving time at the end of Anne's presentation for a roundtable Q&A style discussion so that she can answer any of your questions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. So please click on that button to submit any questions that you might have at any point during the presentation. We will save them, we will see them, and we will answer them. This program is also being recorded today, so we hope that you will share it with your friends who are not able to attend, and we will send it to you following this meeting. We are happy to provide these events at no cost to our audience, so if you enjoy today's program, we would greatly appreciate a donation of any size that enables us to keep providing this important content. You can visit our website, ahec info.org at any time to easily make a gift, and we will put a link in the chat for that as well. So without any further ado, I am thrilled to introduce you to Ann Arnold. Ann is the author of Together, A Journey for Survival, a biography that explores her father's story of survival during the Holocaust in the Polish countryside. Ann's book was awarded the Simon Wiesenthal Center's Heroes for Tolerance Award in 2016. Following the book's success, Anne and her sister Isabella created the Mark Schonwetter Holocaust Education Foundation in honor of their father. Since 2019, Anne has been a prolific public speaker, sharing his story of survival with both adults and students all across the United States. With Anne and Isabella at the helm, the Mark Schonwetter Holocaust Education Foundation has offered grants to schools nationwide to support field trips, classroom resources, programming, and in-person connections with Holocaust survivors. She is now here with us today and is debuting a lesson plan to accompany her book Together, which is now taught in many public schools. Our goal in holding these programs is to provide you all with at least one thing that you can take away and put into action together. After hearing Anne's program, I am confident that you will find at least one thing that you can do. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Anne.
Thank you so very much. I'm really, really happy to be here today. And I'm going to be sharing my screen, so you don't have to just be looking at me. You could also follow along as we go. See, make sure everyone can see that. Great. So I wanted to, first of all, thank the Alabama Holocaust Education Center for having me and for all of you for joining us today. As you heard from Hannah, I love questions. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you so that I make sure that I answer anything that you would like me to talk about. But let me give you a little bit of my background as well. So as you heard, I am the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. It's, something that I feel like I've lived with almost like a chip on my shoulder my whole life. And only other survivors don't really understand what that means. But I will say I was pretty cynical most of my life. When I was younger, before I actually realized I was a writer, I actually am a CPA by trade. But before that, I did write a little bit, let's call it in my closet when nobody was looking. And I added part of this to it's part of the book. And I'd like to start with this poem. Those of you who feel you're not affected are affected the most. Those of you who feel it did not happen to you will experience it the most. Those of you who don't want to remember will have the most terrifying nightmares. Those of you who think it never happened will live through it again. You know, we hear the statement, never forget. And for me, never forget has two meanings. The first meaning is what we all know. We must never forget the stories of the past, but we must learn from them. We must teach them. We must make sure that we let every generation know about them so that hopefully nothing like that will happen again to any person. But never forget to me has a second meaning. We must never forget that even in the ugliest times of history, goodness can prevail. And it's because of that goodness that I'm even here today. So let me give you a little bit of context so that you understand what I'm talking about. So my father was born in a tiny little village in Poland called Brzostek. Brzostek, as you could see here from this little red star, was in the southeast corner of Poland. It had about 1,500 people that lived there prior to the war. By the end of World War II, of those 1,500 people, 500 of them were Jewish. By the end of the war, of those 500 Jewish people, less than 10 of them were still alive, 3 of which was my grandmother, my aunt, and my father. As you could see, this area was surrounded by these skulls and crossbones, which were some of the concentration camps. You probably know of Auschwitz. It's very close to this area. And these were the forests that my dad survived in. In the summer months, he would be in the forest, and in the winter months, he would hide off the goodness of people. Back when the war started in 1939, not much changed, but then it quickly started to change in about 1940, 1941. I had my first trip back to Poland in the early 90s, and it was really quite amazing. We got to go back and see the house that he was born in. This is actually a picture of my father and my aunt in their fields. My grandfather was a farmer. This was the back of their house, and behind this barn, there's a bunch of fields back there. That's where this picture was taken in the bottom. So my grandfather owns a lot of land. He was a farmer, employed a lot of people. This home that you see here is the home my dad grew up in. It was actually cut in half, and my grandfather rented or gave part of that home to the Piłat family, which ended up becoming a very important part of his survival. They were the factory foreman and one of their closest friends. And when I got back in the early 90s, I was able to meet not only some of the people in the Piłat family, but also others that saved my dad. I know that I remember all this story about how in 1942, at this point, my dad had already been kicked out of his home, and they were living in this one room, and they found out that the entire town was going to be rounded up the next day, and all the Jews were going to be gathered. My grandfather had been taken down to police headquarters, which he usually had been done, but that night he didn't come back. That evening, late at night, this is my grandfather, there was a knock on the door. And my grandmother found out that the Germans were going to be rounding them up the next morning. And she quickly ran back to her house, to Mr. Piłat, who you see here, and said, I don't know what to do. And he says, all right, why don't you take your daughter and go to my cousin's, leave your son with me. And my dad tells a story, and it was amazing standing in this house and thinking about the story he had always told me about how he went to sleep that night. And the next morning, very early in the morning, the door basically got broken down and the Gestapo come in and they said, where are the Schonwetters? And Mr. Piłat says, there's no Schonwetters here. I don't know what you're talking about. And they said, listen, we know that the Schonwetters are here and we are going to search for them. And if you don't tell us where they are, we are going to find them. And when we do, we're going to kill them and we're going to kill you. So tell us where they are. And he says, go ahead and look. They're not here. So as they were leaving the room, Mr. Piłat told all the kids to quickly get up and go out into the farm, into the fields to go and do some work. Well, the Gestapo sees all these kids there, and he quickly goes and he turns to the eldest daughter. She's here in this picture. And he says, quick, tell me, how many brothers and sisters do you have? And without hesitation, she says, 8. And he goes and he counts 8 kids. Well, my dad, as he says, was the luckiest kid alive that she was smart enough to include him in that count. And I had the pleasure of meeting her for the first time in the early 90s. And the first thing she said to me was, it was me. I was the one who said that. I was the one. And it was amazing to see how she had lived with that pride her whole life. I remember on that trip that we went and we saw the barn. So let me tell you what the barn's about. After that night when Mr. Pewatt saved my dad, he met with my grandmother and he took them to a ghetto where he thought they would be safer. He said, the only place I know around here that could possibly safe is in Dimbeats. So let's go to the ghetto. So the next day and through the night, they walked over 15 miles to the ghetto from Justek to Dimbeats to try to hopefully escape the Nazis that they knew were running from. They only were in that ghetto for about 3 months. And my father said it was the most horrific experience. And Mr. Pewatt found out that that ghetto was going to be exterminated. So he went back and walked back that 15 miles and found them in the ghetto and helped them escape by my grandmother throwing my father and my aunt over the barbed wire and then climbing over it herself. They then walked back closer to Justek, and he had arranged for a farmer to take them in and for him to live in the attic for the rest of that winter. This is a picture of that attic, and my dad took us up there. And I remember how he told me he was hiding there one day and they heard the Nazis coming up the ladder. And my grandmother quickly hid them under that hay and put her hand over their mouth and said, shh, not a word. There was a pitchfork in the attic. And my dad said he'll never forget that sound. It was the sounds of the pitchfork being stabbed in the hay as the Gestapo was looking to see if anybody was there. They got lucky that day. They didn't get caught. The next few years were spent basically looking for good people to hide them, and also as I mentioned, the summer months, hiding in the forests. They did this through 1944, end of 1944, when the front was getting closer and they realized they had to start hiding as Polish people. Eventually, they were liberated in 1945. And some of the stories are amazing. They hid in the bottom of a pigsty. They hid in floorboards. It's quite amazing. And I always knew bits and pieces of this, but it wasn't until my second trip back to Poland that my life changed forever. You see, their little tiny village of Justek was reconsecrating the Jewish cemetery. So they found out that my father was still alive and asked us to come back to the town and to help them go through this ceremony and to be a witness to the reconsecrating of the Jewish cemetery. So we did. And when the day started, we went back to the town and stopped in front of my dad's old home. And as we were there, these neighbors come out from across the street and they point to us and they turned to my dad and my aunt and they said, "Are you the Schonwetters?" And we all look and we're like, "Who knows us here?" And they're like, "We remember you. We used to play with you when you were a child." And now they start talking and they start pointing to the ground and they said, "Do you remember?" They're talking to each other. "How they used to use their house to separate the Jews. And that one day that man, he tried to run from the line, and right here, right on this ground, this is where they beat him. And they told him that if he moved, they would kill him. And they told us that if we would help him, they would kill him. And we had to wait 3 days watching him die in the street." Now, I'm a crier, I will admit it. And I have to tell you, the day started with just tears coming down my face. We then went into the center of town. And when we got there, there was a crowd around Town Hall. And on the building in Town Hall, they erected this plaque. Now, let me explain to you. There has not been one Jewish person that has lived in this town since 1942. This town hall housed a jail, and it was the only jail in town. And I found out that this was the exact jail that my grandfather was taken to on that fateful night when he was separated from his family. We found out that night that, again, it was a small little village. One of his friends opened the jail cell and told him to take a walk. And when he did, he came back a half hour later. And his friend said, "What are you doing? Don't you understand what I'm telling you? Go, run, be with your family." And he says, "I understand exactly what you told me, but I am the head of the Jewish community here. And I refuse to allow them to use my running as the excuse for why they kill us all. I know I'll die with my people, but please, my wife and my children, help them." That friend was Mr. Piwat's son-in-law. And it was from there that I'm now standing in front of this town hall. And this town has erected this plaque that has actually even given some justification to our existence. They've acknowledged the fact that we even lived in this town to begin with. As I mentioned, there was probably about 40 townspeople that came out, and I was surprised that so many people did. The head priest of the parish came out, the head rabbi of Poland, and I looked around and I couldn't believe anybody really cared, quite honestly. But what happened next really changed me. From here, we walked to the cemetery. It was a short walk down. And as I turned the corner to the cemetery, there was a huge tent that was erected. Over 600 townspeople had come out to witness this day. There were people with babes at their breast, to people that had saved my father and my aunt, to people that had remembered him, that had played with him, all coming to bear witness this day. We were able to erect a tombstone for my grandfather. But more importantly, I found out that the town, on their own, had heard about this project. And what they started to do was dig up masonry work from their own driveways and walls and homes. Because when the Nazis had gone through and destroyed the entire cemetery, they used pieces of the headstone as masonry work. And this town anonymously brought back pieces to the cemetery, and they recovered 33 headstones, one of which was my great-grandfather's. And if it ended there in the beautiful ceremony they put on for us there, it would have been amazing enough, but it didn't end. In the back corner here, you see buses. They put us on buses. There was a few other people there that was part of a contingency that came to witness this as well. And they put all of us on buses and took us to the local high school, where these kids and their parents Googled authentic Jewish food and created a buffet for us, 20 feet long, of homemade cooked food. They then learned Hebrew and started to sing to us and put a concert on for us in Hebrew. Now, I am in a part of Poland that is so remote that in the early 90s, less than 20 years previously when I was there, they were still using horses and buggies as a means of transportation. And these townsfolk embraced us. I really was trying to figure out the whole day, one thing: what's in it for them? Because I personally didn't believe that people could be this good. I knew my dad's stories here and there, but I told you I had a chip on my shoulder. I really was very cynical about the world. I thought that the world was a place that just didn't like me. They murdered my family simply because our God had a different name. And that day, this community embraced us. And I went to the mayor that day and I said, I wanted to, and my mom translated, and I said, I want to thank you for what you've done here for me today. You have given me a place to bring my children back to. And he said, I don't want your thanks. There's no thanks necessary. This was the only thing to do and the right thing to do. And as corny as it sounds, I was changed. I really was. I decided and got motivated to finally come back and get my dad's story down from beginning to end. It was a long process of interviewing him every single week for 6 months. And we started it as a blog. Well, that was really meant mainly for my family. But eventually in 2016, the blog turned into a book. Very quickly, I worked with a teacher and added curriculum content to the book, and the book started being used in schools. Well, as I mentioned, I'm not necessarily think of myself as a writer. I am a businesswoman, accountant by trade. I don't know anything about the education system, but we started speaking in schools. And one day we were speaking in a school, and my father was telling his story, and the teacher comes up to me afterward and said, "We'd love to bring your book in." I said, "Great." So I distribute the book, and the whole thing cost maybe $300 for a classroom set of books. And they said, "Okay, we need to go to the local synagogue to get a donation." And I said, "Get a donation? What are you talking about? You're a school. Don't you have a budget?" They said, "Oh, no, school budgets get cut. We don't have money to bring materials in." I couldn't believe it. So I started researching, and my sister and I had always talked about creating some sort of foundation. And we decided that we were going to do something that didn't exist. There is no place in this country for teachers to go to get support for Holocaust education. And so what I realized is my whole life, I was looking for a purpose. I was looking for almost that survivor's guilt. Why did we survive? Why did my father survive and so many others didn't? There must have been a greater purpose. There must have been a reason for it. And I felt like I was searching my whole life for that. And when we created the foundation, I felt like I figured it out. I survived because it's my job to make sure that these stories go on and that they're not forgotten, that we teach about respect and kindness and anti-hate, that we teach the past in a way to let the future generations know that they have a choice, they have a voice, and it's up to them to decide to use their voice for goodness and kindness so that we can one day drown out the voices of violence and hatred. And I tell you, those voices and everything, I've talked about this for years now. I've been going and I've been speaking. And then October 7th happened. And I have to be honest, I went down a very dark, deep hole. I forgot my own lessons. I forgot my own never forget. And I started focusing on all the negativity that was out there. And about 3.5 weeks after October 7th, my daughter got a phone call from a woman she had met when she was in college. So my daughter went to Elon University in North Carolina. And while she was there, she befriended this woman, Janice. And Janice was a woman in about her late 60s, Black woman. Two of them hit it off and became great friends. And Janice texted my daughter 3.5 weeks after to check in with her to see how she was doing and asked if she could have a conversation. She really didn't understand what exactly everything was that everyone was talking about. So she'd love to talk to her. So my daughter, Lexi, asked me if I would get on the phone with Janice, and I did. And I have to tell you, Janice reminded me. She was the loveliest woman who just wanted to have a conversation and learn and understand what exactly happened on October 7th. What was the political landscape? Who are the terrorists? This, that, and the other thing. She asked me, she said, "I have a question for you. Do you feel very alone right now?" Because I remember after George Floyd that no matter how many of my white friends came to me and tried to say they were with me, it didn't make me feel any less alone because I didn't feel that they truly understood me. Is that how you're feeling? And we bonded and we connected. And I realized Janice was sent to me to remind me of my own lesson, to never forget. To never forget, we all have a voice. We all have a choice. And no matter what your purpose is, no matter what you feel you want to do, we each have the ability to do it. We just have to start somewhere. For me, it started with a blog, and then it turned and led me down this path. For you, it could be something else. But what I hope you take away from here is understanding that we all have that power within us. We just have to believe in it. So with that, I know I've talked a lot and I would love to be able to go into a round table. And Hannah, if you have any questions, I'd love to be able to answer them. And I want to thank you all for just hearing some highlights from my story and my journey as well. So there we go.
There we go. Oh my goodness, Anne. I'm speechless. This was such an incredible story and series of stories that you shared with us just now. I'm going to see if I can place us both on the screen together. There we
There we
go.
go.
Um, I'm truly in awe. And so I want to start off by saying thank you so much for sharing everything that you've just shared with us. I have so many questions and responses to everything that you shared. I think the place that I want to start is I want to focus more on this theme of remembrance that really jumped out for me. So you mentioned during your presentation these individuals who remembered your father, you know, over decades, who remembered him as a young boy, and who even during the trials of the Holocaust, who remembered your family as fellow citizens, as neighbors, as people in their community who were still part of that town. When you think about the work that the Mark Schonwetter Foundation does, and the way that you work with students today, what do you want them to remember about your family? What do you want remembrance to mean to them?
So again, I think it's beyond just my family. I think it's about remembering that we each have a place in history. And what's interesting is you never really think about how you affect somebody else's life. You may have an encounter, or you may have a much longer relationship. What I had the privilege of seeing was how what I always considered my story actually was someone else's story from a different perspective. So when I went back to Poland, I actually went back in 2016, and I got to meet the grandson of Mr. Piwat. So after the war, my grandmother she had a house on her land that she gave to Mr. Piwat and his family as a way almost of saying thank you. He didn't do it for that reason, but she promised him, if we ever make it, this house is yours. His grandson lives on that property today. And when we were there and we saw the grandson, he has rebuilt the house since then, but he has saved a corner of his house as a shrine that he's created for his family so that they always remember their role in saving people and what it meant for their family. And it was the first time I started to realize, wow, the story is not just mine. There's this whole other side of the story, which is the Piwat family story, about how they probably lived in fear every day that they were going to get caught in helping my family, and how they have now, through the generations, passed that along to their children. So no matter what we do in our own lifetime, there are ripple effects of it through future generations that we don't even realize can happen. So I would hope that everyone remembers that everything we do will touch someone in some way. So do you want that to be a positive way or a negative way? And think about that as you go through your life and do everything that you do.
Absolutely. And you mentioned this really transformative journey that, you know, you mentioned you were a crier. I found myself welling up, just the gestures of restoration and goodwill and real genuine emotional investment in what had happened in that place, from the descendants of those who were there, from those that were there when it happened. This whole experience in Poland in 2009. Have you been back since then, and what have those experiences been like?
So, and I hear a lot, and I am not disputing that anti-Semitism exists.
Hmm.
And I hear this all the time because Poland is known as a very anti-Semitic country. I will say, through research in the book, the Galicia region, which is where my dad is from,
Mhm.
historically has been a less anti-Semitic place than others. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It exists everywhere in the world, not just Poland.
Mhm.
My experiences had been only those of a very welcoming community. In 2012, someone was walking through the forests nearby Brzostek, and saw a piece of stone sticking out of the ground. When they started to wipe away and figured out, they realized that it was the tombstone for the mass grave where the Jews from Justek and the surrounding areas were murdered. So that's where my grandfather was. Now, we knew that this place existed. We didn't know where it was at the time. The town and the surrounding towns created a memorial, and a beautiful memorial in the middle of the forest for this. So in 2016, I had the opportunity to go back. And again, the town welcomed us. They had a special guide take us to the forest to show us where this is. They had like gift bags for us. I mean, I brought my daughter back and my 2 nephews with us. So it was really, really an amazing trip once again of showing how open and loving this community happened to be. Again, I understand that maybe not everyone experiences. This was my experience. I've only experienced just wonderful things going back to Poland.
Well, I'm so happy to hear that. And also so grateful that you were able to visit and bring your family as well, the way that you had intended.
Yes, absolutely. It was wonderful. I just felt bad. My older daughter was in college. She couldn't come with us,
Yeah.
but she'll make it. We'll get her
You'll
back.
have to make a third trip. Um, you know, one of the things that is very common in the story of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe and in Poland is that a lot of these atrocities occurred, as you mentioned in your story, away from the centers of population, away from these towns, in places like the forests, in places like the wilderness between the ghettos and between the camps. You mentioned that 15-mile walk that your father took in his journey. Tell us more about that piece of his story and some of the work that you're doing around it.
Absolutely. Thank you. So again, I never really knew the distance. I just knew that my dad escaped and had to go to a ghetto. It wasn't until I started writing and researching more and we realized how far that was. And then talking to my dad, I'm like, Dad, I don't get it. He's like, it's what we did. We walked. You didn't have a choice. We had to get there and we did it. So when my sister and I created the foundation, every foundation or these organizations, they'll have gala events, they'll do things. We decided that what really went with our mission was more about this Holocaust education, this awareness. And we decided to create an event called Journey for the Living. Journey for the Living is a month-long fitness challenge where we encourage participants to walk. You could run or ride 15 miles in a month. You could do 15 miles that month to do the journey. You could be a warrior and do 15 miles a week, or you could become a champion and do 15 miles in a day. I will tell you, we've had 2 people do the 15 miles in a day challenge, and they both said they will never do it again. They said they couldn't walk for days after that. But it's one of our major fundraisers, but it's also an awareness campaign. And there's schools that participate because for schools it's free, and they'll have their students walk it to try to add some way of almost putting your feet to the ground, to walk in those footsteps and let people reflect on it. And then it's meant to be an awareness because as you're walking during the month, this year it takes place in May. Registration opens April 1st. I hope you all join us and create teams and walk with your family. And it's really a time of reflection. We actually have expanded Journey for the Living to include clubs and for those that are bar and bat mitzvah age students, mitzvah project challenges. And I've had these bar and bat mitzvah age students that do this at any time during the year. The global event is in May, but they'll do it and they will have every mile they walk with a different friend. Or I've had one where they had their whole family walk at the beginning and their whole family walk at the end with them, the last mile and the first mile. So many different ways for you to include your family, your coworkers, your friends. And the point is that we are following in someone else's footsteps, but what we're going to do is choose to do something good with that. So I'm really excited to let everybody know that we are working closely with the Alabama Holocaust Education Center this year. And for Journey for the Living, anybody that does register and raise money in Alabama, we are going to be allocating that money to go directly back to specifically schools in Alabama for Holocaust education. So I'm really excited about that partnership. And I'm really excited that we're able to really designate funds directly to the state so that the children in your state and those generations can learn about it.
Definitely. And we are so thrilled to be partnering with you all. We're also very excited to have this opportunity to really give students a tangible piece of Holocaust history to help them sort of just catch a glimpse at the things that people did to survive and to persist in the face of this darkness.
Yeah.
So we'll have more information about Journey for the Living as we get closer to that date. Now, I do see that we have a question in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and read it out for all of our listeners and put it to you, Anne. So Esther asks, how did you approach the schools to get them to agree to teach about the Holocaust?
So it's a very interesting. It depends on the state. So right now, 26 states mandate Holocaust education. With that said, I need to be clear. There is a very big difference between mandating and funding. So when a state mandates Holocaust education, they're saying that the teacher has to teach it. Okay, well, how's the teacher going to implement that? So there are different commissions in every state and different mechanisms in every state to try to get the teacher's curriculum and get them ways to teach it. So in the states that have, so to date, we have given grants out to schools in 31 different states. So as you could see, we've given some grants out to schools in more than the 26 states that mandated it. In general, what I'm finding is teachers really do want to teach this. They just don't necessarily, not that they don't know how, some don't know how, and there's a lot of professional development that they can take to learn, but they also don't have a means.
I think we may have lost Anne for a moment. It may just be my connection.
Oh, can you hear
Oh,
me?
yes, we
Can
can
you
hear
hear
you
me?
now.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know what
That's all
happened.
right.
All right. So yeah, it says my internet connection is unstable. That always, it's like Murphy's Law. It's only going to happen because we're on this call.
Naturally.
So, okay. So did you hear when I was saying about how many states we've reached
Yes.
already?
The
Okay.
last thing we heard you say was in regards to mandating doesn't necessarily equal funding.
Right. So when these teachers want to teach it, they don't have the access or ability to bring any sort of materials into the classroom to help them. So I have been reaching out, and the way we're getting to teachers is by partnering within each state, different Holocaust centers, Holocaust commissions, different museums that have students that come and participate or come into the museum. Plus, we do a lot of teacher outreach through different publications that they have, so that if a teacher really does want to teach this, they know that there's funds available for them. And, you know, it's one thing when you live in a large city and you're able to have access to a center to come and see. But when you're living in a really remote area, it's very difficult. And I'm going to give you an example. In North Carolina, that's one example of a state that we worked with. And we did a webinar through the Holocaust Commission there for all their teachers. So one of their teachers applied for a grant and sent me a letter afterward. This is a very rural part of North Carolina. It's called Yancey County. They said they're out in the middle of nowhere. They have something called the 88 Club, which is a notorious Nazi youth group that today actively recruits students from their middle and high school. This teacher was able to use our grant money and bring books into the classroom so that 2 middle school classes are now learning about the Holocaust. And in her words, she said, "You are pushing back against neo-Nazis here in Yancey County." So when you ask, how do we get to the teachers? I think there are teachers, they really do want to teach it. They know about the history. They just don't know how. And they don't know where to go to be able to find resources. One of the things we do is we also have resource webinars where we try to expose teachers to all different resources that are out there, even if they're in a rural part. I know the Alabama Holocaust Education Center has amazing resources for teachers in your state, so that if you do have a school or if your children go to a school and you have a conversation with the teacher about, hey, do we teach any Holocaust education here? You know that there's some place for you to direct them. We're trying to do our best by speaking to as many departments of state as we can, as well as many, quite honestly, organizations that have touch points with teachers as we can. I hope that answered your question, and thank you for it.
I think so. And just a reminder to everyone, any questions that you might have, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A forum. But another part of your story, Anne, that I wanted to revisit is something that we explore often here at the AHEC through our programming and also through some of our social media presence is the experience of the children of survivors. And we shared a video a few months ago about one woman's experience that she likened her father's reluctance to share his memories with her as being trapped in a room. And he essentially said to his daughter, this is a place that I have lived in since this happened to me. If I tell you about it, you can enter this room, but you can never leave. And so, in that man's particular story, he had a very strong desire to shield his daughter from the trauma that he had
Yeah.
experienced. And not every family has that same story. I think there's a constellation of ways that survivors respond to the horrors that they experienced. What was it like for you going on this journey of remembering and interviewing with your father?
It's interesting because, as I mentioned, I always knew, I don't want to use the word Holocaust survivor because I'm a little older than you. So back when I was little, there was no such thing as a Holocaust survivor. The Holocaust was really labeled as something that people went through Auschwitz. That was all that you heard, the Holocaust. It wasn't until later that the Holocaust as an umbrella, let's call it, really started to include others. So, and I remember being young and my dad coming into my Hebrew school and telling his story of survival to my Hebrew school class. And I asked my dad once, I said, when did you first tell me about this? And he says, it just happened organically. Like little kids get annoyed at your parents and you're like, oh, your mom probably didn't make you do this or that. Did your mom make you, clear the dishes or blah, blah, blah. And my dad said, when you used to do that and your sister, I would kind of answer you by saying, well, life was a little different than yours. And that's how we slowly brought these conversations in. Because I really don't remember the first time I heard it. But my grandmother, interesting, my dad always said that after the war, my grandmother never spoke about it. As a family, him, my aunt, and my grandmother, they never really talked about it. But when the grandchildren were born, she started talking about it. And they asked her, they're like, Mom, why are you talking about this now? And she said, because we all lived through it. We didn't need to talk about it again. We're not forgetting it, but it's the kids. We have to make sure the kids know what we went through so that they remember it. And she was very vocal about making sure to tell the stories to her grandchildren. Now, unfortunately, she lived in Israel, so I didn't see her. My cousins in Israel got the benefit of her a lot more than me. But when she came, I remember asking questions as well. So now fast forward to 2009, and I said, okay, I'm going to sit down and get this story down. And it was amazing all the details I had missed and I didn't know. But what was really, really crazy was when I did the book, because I had done the blog over 6 months. With the book, I had been trying to figure out how to turn this into a book for so long. And I was sitting on a board. This is why, networking, I'm telling you, networking works. And I would always throw this out in the universe. And I was sitting on a board and this woman says to me, you know what? I want to introduce you to a woman. So she introduces me to the woman and sends my blog to her. And she calls me and she goes, okay, you're going to do this. We're going to do it. I said, what are we doing? She goes, we're writing a book. I said, no, we're not. I said, I'm busy. I'm not writing a book. She's like, yes, we are. Yes, we are. So what she did is she re-interviewed my father for another 6 months, every week for another 6 months. And the reason I'm saying this is there was very interesting, the stories that he would tell her that he wouldn't tell me. And she would call me afterward and say, well, I spoke to your dad today and he told me, Ann doesn't really know these details. And it was tiny details that she was really getting to, but that almost like, for instance, there's a part where they're hiding and it's winter time and he was actually lost in the woods in the snow and he urinated around all over himself. And he was embarrassed to tell me that. But she got that out of him, details like that I was able to get for the book. And then I interviewed my aunt and I started to interview her separate from my father. it is amazing how things come together when you start to hear another perspective. So there was parts of the story where my aunt knew it one way and my dad knew it another way. And I would realize that when I put them together, it was the whole story. And then the two of them would argue. So, like the night that I mentioned to you, where my dad was left at Mr. Pewatt's house and what happened the next morning, the way my aunt would tell the story was that my dad ran away and they didn't know what happened to him the whole night and that they found him the next morning. She didn't know that story of my, and until I wrote the book, she didn't know that story because they never spoke about it.
Yeah.
So it was amazing to see, you know, there was some parts of the story that I just took for granted, but I always thought it was a little weird. I'm like, really? How did that happen? But okay, if you tell me it happened that way, it did. And then when I spoke to my aunt, she filled in pieces. And I said, well, that makes a lot more sense than this. So it's funny because if you hear my dad tell his story from beginning to end, and then you read the book, there are tiny bits that are a little different. And it's because I got the rest of the story from my aunt to fill it in. And I'm not going to correct my dad. That's his memories.
Sure,
Let
sure.
him have his memories. But it's really interesting going through the process and then learning all of these other new bits and pieces. The hardest part for me personally, you talked about living in a room and you can never get out. I
Mhm.
never heard that before, but it resonates so deeply with me because I always knew my grandma as my Baba. She was this little 5 foot woman, nicely, you know, I used to lie, play with her arm, lie on her bosom, the whole thing. As I was writing the book, you start to get into your character. As an author, you start to get into the characters. And I started to get into the head of my grandmother.
Mm.
And I, at the time, my kids were in their teenage years. And I remember sitting in my office one day, writing and editing. It was close to the end of the process. And I lost it. I had a complete breakdown because I realized my grandmother was a woman. She
Mm.
wasn't just my grandmother. She was a mother. She was a woman. The fear, I started to feel the fear she must have lived with. I started to feel the emotions. And it was probably because I was so intense in writing this and getting into the character. It affected me to my core that to this day, I feel almost traumatized to the sense that I have a hard time. It's so hypocritical. I have a hard time reading books about
Mm.
the Holocaust. I have a hard time watching a movie or listening because I internalize it so much. I think partially is I realize my own that PTSD and they say that you can transfer trauma from one generation to the other. I feel like I understand what that is now. And I love what you said about the door opening and you can't get out because that's how I feel. It's so hard because now I just every time I hear a story, I'm like tears are calming down and it's very difficult. But living through that experience and hearing that story and down to the details, it, now when I tell the story, it becomes a story and I have to disassociate myself with what I'm talking about. Because if I start thinking about it, or if when I hear my dad speak, if I start hearing his words and start thinking about him living through it, I get too emotional. I have to distance myself from it because it's hard for me to think about.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, I can only imagine, of course, that process of realization, not only that, this is someone that you love who's been through something awful. And so you feel on that level that, oh, like my Baba went through this. But also, just as you said, that these people who are almost mythical figures in our childhood
Yeah,
being just as flesh and blood as we are and having the same uncertainty, for us, these historical events are almost pre-written. We know
right.
the ending, but to live through history actively, and of course, each day for us is history now, um, is a totally different experience. So,
Absolutely.
my final question, I want to end on that note and then really think about that theme. Here in Alabama, we're in a place that is the crucible of so much rich and often difficult and traumatic history. This is a city where the civil rights movement was at its apex, where resistance to the civil rights movement was also at its apex. And I think many of us educators, students, whoever we are in whatever walk of life, approach history in that distanced way. We see it as a story written down, we see it as a textbook with a start and a beginning. But the truth is that all of us carry a kernel of that within us. And, just as you mentioned earlier in your presentation, just as your father's story was completely his story, it was also the story of his neighbors and of the other townspeople, and that was their world entire as well. What takeaways do you have for those of us who are looking into our own histories, who are the descendants of our own legacies, whatever those stories may be, who are grappling with that for the first time?
First thing I would probably say, don't be afraid of it, because it's so easy to not want to face it. It's so easy to just keep pushing it off the side, which is what I did for so many years. Yeah, I kept pushing it off. I lived my life. Don't be afraid of it. Embrace it. And not everyone is going to have an aha moment like I had. I know that. That was just me. Don't make my story yours, but think about your own life. And everyone's got, in a small way, something that they want to do. No matter how, whether it's finally wanting to tell your story to your children, or finally wanting to visit this place or that, whatever it may be. Don't always think in grandiose, think in smaller chunks, and then things will happen. But again, I think a lot of it is our own fear that stops us from going forward and doing something. Don't be afraid. I have failed so many times in my life, I can't count. And such a thing that we always hear everyone say, oh, I failed. But the truth is, it happens. And the first time may not work, and the second time it does. But just embrace it and have fun with it. That's the thing. Like, I still have a whole nother career and job. And I was telling Hannah before, I do so many other things outside the foundation, but I have fun with this. And that's why I'm doing it. It's become my passion, and I'm doing it as much as I'm doing it because I'm enjoying it. So don't forget, don't forget there's fear stopping you, but have fun with what you're doing as well.
Hmm. Well, I'm going to allow that to be our last question because it was such a beautiful response. And I want to say once again, we are beyond lucky to have had you as a speaker for our
Thank you
Taking
for
Action
having me.
Together program. Thank you. I want to remind everyone that we will be following up this presentation with a link and a recording. Feel free to share with your friends, your family. We get our best traction by word of mouth, and we greatly appreciate all of our audience who forwards our recording, our schedule of programs. If this program was valuable to you, please consider a donation to the AHGC. It will help us continue this important education. And please be aware that our next program, Anti-Semitism in the Algorithm, which will offer a deep dive into hate speech and trends on social media, will be coming on March 20th at noon Central Time. So we'll be adding more and more programming along the way that we hope you will find of interest. And thank you once again, everyone.
Thank
We
you,
look forward to
everybody.
seeing you soon. Thank you.